They put houses and towers on the Oliphaunts' backs and all, and the Oliphaunts throw rocks and trees at one another. Hey everyone, Yoiston here, and I hope you all are doing well, wherever you are in Middle-earth. Today we are discussing the Mûmakil, or Oliphaunts, of Middle-earth, as well as how the Hobbits knew about them in their stories and folklore, despite being on the other side of the continent from them. Related articles and videos are in the description and cards. My friends, thank you all so much for joining me today. Let's begin our tale. The Oliphaunts, a word which closely resembles elephant, was the Hobbitish word for the great elephant-like creatures out of Harad, wherein they were called Mûmakil. A Mûmak was a gargantuan elephant with giant tusks, long floppy ears, and a giant serpentine snout. These great animals had no equal in terms of size and strength among all of the mythic beasts of Middle-earth, and in their history, much resemble stories of our own real history of men taming elephants and using fear to drive them into combat, such as Hannibal and his elephants thousands of years ago. Now, their size, but also their natural toughness of hide, made it nearly impossible to slay. At some point, the men of Harad began to tame these creatures and build great saddles that they would use against the men of Gondor. When exactly this happened, or for how long they were used in war, is unknown, but I would guess the early Third Age is when all of this started. There are no mentions of Mûmakil in the War of the Last Alliance, and truly we don't get much of them until the events of the War of the Ring at the end of the Third Age anyway. Now, one of the most interesting things about the Mûmakil is that they were known to the Hobbits through at least one ancient poem, but why would this be the case since Hobbits don't live anywhere close to Harad? Well, Hobbits were a race of folk that derived from the race of men, and so perhaps this actually reinforces another explanation concerning the lore of the Hobbits before the Third Age, or at least before the middle of it when they started appearing in the stories of Middle-earth. Perhaps, before the Hobbits came to the Vales of Anduin in northwestern Rhovanion, they were folk of the East and South, originally having perhaps evolved from the men who stayed in the East at the beginning of the First Age, and coming away from that land after Sauron's influence spread and their peace and safety was upset. Indeed, maybe that is why they were such a reclusive people away from the big folk, because their ancestors might have had to deal with men who fell under the influence of Sauron, and those same men would go on to tame the Oliphaunts, and thus the Hobbits knew of them, seeing them as amazing creatures in a place near where they once perhaps lived. We can also assume that since Hobbits didn't really want to deal much with the big folk in particular, it likely wasn't some sort of traveler who had seen an Oliphaunts and told the Hobbits about this that gave them their inspiration. It's possible, just not likely in my opinion. Now, it could also be that in one of those relatively strange and rare times, there was a halfling or a hobbit in the early part of the Third Age that took an adventure and crossed into the southeastern part of Middle-earth and came into Harad. This, of course, would allow him to have seen a Mûmak and come up with his own name or story for such a wonderful creature, before coming back to his people and sharing that tale with them, something that they likely believed was only a myth. It is just one of those things that is so fascinating. Hobbits do not know much about the world at large and its great elven lore and history. They know close to nothing from their own records about the times before the Third Age, at least any that is shared with us, the readers from the Hobbits. But somehow they still know about the Oliphaunts, at least Hobbits like Sam did, through the old poems. Enough of them even knew about the Oliphaunts that Sam didn't think they would believe any of his stories about them when he got home. So that would be my guess, that the foremost of the Hobbit ancestors were actually men that were apart from the three houses of the Edain, and their descendants came from the east who had become the Hobbits, and those Hobbits had seen Oliphaunts themselves, naming them in their own language, and thus creating their own poem that, I think, only a Hobbit would make based on its language. Continuing on from there, we must discuss them in the late Third Age. When Faramir's rangers ambushed Haradrim and drove one of their Oliphaunts mad into the wild, these men seemed to know of these creatures and roughly how to defeat them, and they also used the name Mûmakil, and they also knew how dangerous they were. Yet, they could still not stop all of the Mûmakil, as many later came to the Battle of the Pelennor Fields and slew many Rohirrim and their horses, as well as two notable archers from the Blackroot Vale, Durufin and Dwelin. These Oliphaunts were driven to violence, but again, with how hobbits see them, not much with fear but with wonder. that makes me think that it was really the malice and fear from the men who drove the Mûmakil into battle that really gave them their deadly nature, but beyond this, I don't think they would be particularly evil nor peaceful sorts of creatures. After the war was won, Sam wandered near the fields of Cormallen during the celebrations, in search of the lost Mûmak who was driven mad by the ambush of the Rangers to no avail. Perhaps this Mûmak would wander the lands of Gondor for a time, but due to its past as a war elephant, it is more likely than not that it was hunted down and slain by the men of Gondor, lest other men of Gondor were injured or slain by it. It is said in the Two Towers that the kin of those Mûmakil of the time that exists today are but memories of their strength and immensity. So it is likely that the Mûmakil are one of the mythic creatures of Middle-earth that mark a historic wonderment of nature that did not continue to exist into what Tolkien saw as the modern age of the world. Therefore, to the sorrow of a hobbit like Sam, it is quite likely that they went extinct as they were, either hunted for their ivory and hides or simply depopulated through things like war, such as further war with Gondor and Rohan in the Fourth Age, or natural selection, to where their descendants were simple elephants. We of course do not know how many of these creatures existed, and perhaps those at the Battle of the Pelennor Fields were the last. Like many creatures in Tolkien's works, they themselves were but wild beasts, and were tamed by cruel masters to do harm in ancient days. And so, like Sam, we must use stories and poems to conceptualize their true, incredible nature and wonderment. And so, my friends, we come to the end of our tale on the Mûmakil, or Oliphaunts of Middle-earth. From this tale, we see the neutrality of nature, which can be stewarded by and for peace, or tamed towards destruction and chaos. Thank you all so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed this exploration. If you did, please be sure to hit that like button and share this with a friend. What are your thoughts on the Mûmakil? Let me know in the comments below. I love seeing creatures like these in Tolkien's works. They vastly open up the world building and exploration of the tales and places in Middle-earth. If you'd like to support the channel, please consider getting some candles from our friends Mythologie Candles, or order some Weta or United Cutlery, Lord of the Rings swords, statues, and other replicas from Castle Kon, who does international shipping, and use the code WEST at checkout, and please check our merch and Patreon. Thanks to our Valar tier patrons and YouTube members, Peter Shepard, John Hume, Maz Gibbs, Reese Jenkins, Arthur Merlin, Theodore, Moon Viper, Andrew Carlisle, and Zumi. Thank you so much to all of you guys, really appreciate it. Please subscribe and hit that bell button to join the Men of the West and all of the Free Peoples today, and I'll see you all again next week with a video on who was Gothmog. It seems that this character was interpreted very differently in different types of Lord of the Rings adaptations, so it will be interesting to explore him. My friends, thank you all so much for joining me on this adventure. Until the next one.